And now it's time for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and Michael Best Strategies.
Hi, I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
And I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And we're the Insiders. And there's few events more of insiderish than the State of the State speech. Very few people watch it except all of the insiders and the legislature itself. So the governor's got his State of the State speech coming up. He's got a huge budget surplus to work with. What do you think we're going to hear in Tony Evers' most recent State of the State speech?
Well, I think you'll hear a heavy dose of education. Like the governor has been in education his entire life. He believes in it, and I think rightfully so. And Wisconsin has always believed in it. And I think this will be his opportunity to talk about investments and that, and it'll be great. He has a rare opportunity, though, because of this huge surplus. Not only could he invest in education, I think that if he really wanted to push it, what he would also do at the same time is really take a dramatic swing at reducing school property taxes. I think that not only is education as an issue important, but getting down the cost of what paid for it would enormously help him in his efforts to get people behind more for education. So in other words, if you can take people's property tax bill for education and cut it in half, which he probably could do given this surplus, he would have a home run both on the policy and on the taxation side. And I think people would appreciate that. I think they would rally around it. And frankly, I think even Republicans would be behind it, because what's changed in the legislature is that rural areas, which are frankly dominated by property taxes for schools, not for their municipalities, they would benefit disproportionately from this. I think that the legislators would hear about it. And at the end of the day, they might say, hey, nobody knows that we passed another income tax cut. But wouldn't it be nice coming up on an election for us to be able to see a big property tax relief? And by the way, you could do it both this year and next year. There's so much money. That could be a winning strategy that might work on a bipartisan basis and would be an unusual take, and a take that Republicans who are really smart and looking at this Supreme Court race and looking at redistricting might say, this might also help me in what's going to be a very difficult race. Who wouldn't like to go into that election saying, hey, I cut your property taxes in our district by 20%. So I'll be interested to see if the powers that be can figure this out, and maybe it will happen. But I think that's a winning strategy. And with that amount of money, you can both pay for education and pay for property tax relief.
Well, they'd be smart to take your advice. But as I recall, the governor said on election night, boring wins. And so I think they're unlikely to be bold or take a big departure and do something unusual. I think it's more likely that when you're watching this speech, you're going to go, wait, is this a rerun? I think I saw this one once before. The governor will be talking about more money for schools, more money for roads, more money for broadband. People will be starting to fall asleep. Then he's going to throw in his liberal wish list, right? He's going to say that we need to make abortion legal all the way up until the date of birth, and we need to make marijuana legal all across the state of Wisconsin. And he's going to know that neither of those two things are going to happen. So, I mean, I think it's going to be the Tony Evers we've seen pretty consistently over the last 4 years, and no big bold proposals, but lots of the same sort of priorities and the same steady Eddie. Let's do more for the schools. Let's do more for the roads. Let's give people broadband. That's what I'm expecting. But gosh, I'd be interested to see the sort of speech you laid out there. I hope the trial balloon isn't shot down.
Well, Scott, it's what's interesting. I hope folks were listening to Scott, because every issue that Scott talked about there, and it will be part of Tony's speech, is one that has at least 60% support in the public.
Sure. Even
on abortion. And I think the Republicans, and of course, this is a story that you've heard from me many times now, but I think the Republicans are really the dog that caught the car on abortion. I think they're in a really bad spot out there. And I think to the extent that Governor Evers brings that issue up, I think it's going to move even more voters in the suburbs around Milwaukee over toward the Democratic side. I think Republicans have a very difficult time, because I think Scott is right. I think that is the wish list. It's not the ultra liberal wish list. I think it's just the wish list of the people of the state of Wisconsin. That's going to be a very difficult thing for Republicans to fight against. Really, they're against broadband. Really, they don't want to fix the roads. Don't we think there ought to be some abortions? Don't we want women to make that choice? I mean, if you go just down the tick list there, more money for education. Wow, I think that's a pretty hard one for Republicans to be against, unless you've got gerrymandered seats and you have 60-some votes in the assembly.
So I do think the governor is going to be generally steady Eddie, as it usually is in all this sort of stuff. I think the abortion question, as you bring it up, is one where there'll be some fascinating politics between the legislature and the governor. The governor will want to have broadly available abortion services late into a pregnancy. The Republicans will say, hey, we'd be willing to tinker with the 1848 or 1849 law and provide exceptions for rape and incest. And I think the governor would veto that bill. At least that's what he has said he would do. Maybe he's just jawing and he's hoping he can get the Republicans to give him something bigger than that. But as you know, when you would take a look at the polling on this issue, most people would say that abortion should be limited to the early months of a pregnancy, to the first 3 or 4 months. That is a number that is much higher than 60% if you take a look at the polling. And the Republicans won't drop that on his desk, but they may drop on his desk a tinkering with the 1849 law and the politics that may require the governor to veto it, which would be difficult for him to explain, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard the best spokesman for the Republican Party. Did you see how complex and how time-consuming that response had to be? For one rare moment here, Democrats will have the bumper sticker and the Republicans will not. Here's the simple answer of Democrats. Repeal the 1849 law, which makes abortion criminal. A law that was passed before women in Wisconsin could even vote. Give this choice back to the women of the state and leave us alone. That's the Democratic answer. That's a very powerful answer. I think Scott is giving the best defense he can. That is not where people are going to be. And Robin Vos saying, well, you know, maybe rape, but only if they report it to a police officer, et cetera. You know what? Women in the state look at that and say, here's a guy who doesn't get it. And guess what? That is not going to sell. It's not going to sell this spring. It's not going to sell in the legislature. And I'll tell you what, if we do get redistricting redone, watch out for 2024 and what happens with this issue still viable.
Well, we'll see what the State of the State speech has, if it's the usual bread and butter issues, or if it's the hot button issues that Chuck has been talking about. But always interesting to look forward to it. I know all the insiders will be watching.
We'll see you next time.
See you next week.
Listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen. Sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and Michael Best Strategies.